Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're delighted that you're able to join us for this Georgia Independent School Association Crisis Coach webinar. This is actually the 9th in the series, although we did take time off for the summer, so you won't be able to find versions 6, 7, 8. Today we're discussing how to cope with natural disasters and keep your business going and your school going. Wind, water, earth, and fire. Our presenter today is Jeff Hamilton. Jeff is located in California, and he is the president of an organization called Nexis Preparedness. And we're pleased that he's had the time to join us and wake up early for us. We'd also like to have you become our friend on Facebook. We're Firestorm Solutions on Facebook. On Twitter, we're known as Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We need to remind you that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is pleased to have an ongoing relationship and a good relationship with the Georgia Independent School Association. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch past webinars in the series for the last 2 or 3 years and register for future webinars. They're held on a monthly basis. As I mentioned, our presenter, Jeff Jackson, is normally with us. Jeff is out assisting customers and members of the Georgia Independent School Association. He's not able to join us. Our presenter today is Jeff Hamilton. As I mentioned, he's the president of Nexis Preparedness Systems. Located in California, he's had many years of experience in how to cope with disasters, and especially being on the shaky side of the country, his emphasis is on earthquakes and wildfires and all those other kind of things. So, Jeff, over to you, please.
Thank you, Bill, and good morning to everybody. With Nexis Preparedness Systems, our focus is on effective emergency response. And today, I want to talk about a component of that, which is certainly the emergency response supply. And major events that involve wind, water, earth, and fire often result in regional issues that can be for extended time frames and can cause you to rely on emergency response resources. And these are potential situations where the local authorities may be overwhelmed, and it will be up to you to protect your site, your employees, and in the case of Georgia Independent Schools, your students. And certainly, Bill mentioned we're out here in earthquake country, and that tends to be our focus for a large regional event. Well, certainly the weather situations back east have caused a lot of regional events that have isolated businesses and schools and made it difficult to get around, and probably overwhelmed first responders. So what we want to do today is cover supply resources in a more holistic and analytical approach, and making sure that those resources are integrated and aligned to your specific plans and your specific threat. And very important is to know how to utilize those resources, and understand that what you have at your disposal will also be a key factor. Well, let's look at the math of it all from an analytical side of resources. And oftentimes, emergency response supplies are thought of kind of in a vacuum. And somebody will say, well, I've got an emergency response team, I put together an emergency response team, and I better go get some supplies. And they really need to be thought of more holistically. And we usually sit down and try to list out what we think we need. And of course, well, I need some food, I need some water, Probably better get some lighting, flashlights, some batteries, maybe a generator. If I have to do any search and rescue, maybe need some things in that particular area. And if anybody gets hurt, certainly need some first aid items. We're here in earthquake country, as I mentioned, and a lot of times it could be for extended time, and the infrastructure may be compromised. It may be the same situation where flooding happens in large regional disasters like that, and so you need to make some provisions for sanitation, as an example. And so you're really kind of left with, so what do how much of these things do I need to get? How do I scale this up and figure out what I really need? And what am I forgetting? Am I forgetting something in particular? And the things you need to think about are those, when you're designing your supply solution, what are all of the threats that you're going to be faced with? Mentioned, we're going to think about earthquakes here, but are we at a site that is near flooding? Is it near wildfire? Is it near chemical spills? Are there things we need specific to those types of threats? Flooding may be more of an issue back in your area. They may, maybe the top, severe weather may be a top item that you have. You have threats that you need to consider as well. Lockdown situations. Are the supplies aligned to meet your lockdown situation in the school plan? If you're going to the extent of doing search and rescue, do you have the right kind of supplies that your team is trained to use? Or if you're simply doing something where you're doing evacuations in kind of a forward type of approach, there are certain things you may need for that, and as your team and your program matures and you decide to get into more extensive levels of emergency response, those supplies can be gotten later, but you still need to think about it. Talk about food and water for a certain period of time, food and water for 3 days. Well, what does that really mean? And let me kind of get into what we're talking about here, and when I talk about the math of it all. So let's say you know that you need some power, and so you're going to get a generator, maybe some gas. Is that really meeting your objective? Well, you need to start peeling the onion back a little bit here. And so the objective may be more along the lines of, I need power for 3 8-hour increments, the evenings, as an example. You're going to cover things for a 3-day period. What am I trying to power? If I'm doing some area lights, in this case I picked a number, let's say we're going to do 8 area lights. Maybe we want to power up some laptop computers. So you really have to start thinking about the metrics around that. Well, look at the generator. A 6,000-watt generator uses 1.8 gallons an hour. Well, that gas can up there is a 5-gallon gas can. Is that going to cover the amount of fuel you need to cover your time duration? In this case, it's not. A lot of times we look at a supply case cache and they've got their gas can, but they've never filled it up. We talked about powering lights. Well, if there are 8 500-watt halogen lights, as an example, you're probably sized the generator okay. They're the dual-headed 1,000-watt lights, then you may be undersized for that particular generator. Excuse me, powering a laptop computer. Power quality is very important when dealing with sensitive components like computers. You need the kind of power like you get plugging in the wall. The generator we have shown here is a basic power generator that's not going to give very clean power signal. So for laptops and computers, you need to consider using what's called an inverter style generator, and it gives a very clean power signal out of that generator. Think about how your area is going to be lined out. If you're going to be lighting up your incident command area, you're going to be lighting up a first aid area, maybe even a sanitation area, you're going to have to get some extension cords. Well, the kind of cords you need, the distances you need, they have to be the right gauge. You have to think about it in terms of those types of components. So those are just an example of how, even looking at just the concept of getting a generator, thinking about it in a lot more detail. So you really need to do the math on all the items. Consider the usage rates. How long will batteries last? Sanitation, or what kind of chemical usage might there be? How many people are you trying to cover for how long? What are the specialized groups that need to be supported? Maybe you have a search and rescue team. You've got people trained in first aid and triage, recovery teams, those types of things. When considering food and water, unfortunately, the only metric out there that even FEMA puts out is that you need a half a gallon of water per person per day. And they'll just simply say you need food for 3 days. Well, what does that mean? Well, we use basal metabolic rate, and you can look that up on the internet. It's a very simple calculation. And generally, if you do the math on those, it says that everybody generally needs about 2,400 calories a day. Do you have any unique needs for your site? As an example, some of the companies we deal with have daycare centers. Maybe some of the schools may have a daycare center associated with it. Infants and some level toddlers have very specific needs. You can't feed an infant just water and grind up some food bars and hopefully they'll be okay. They need to get all their hydration from formula. Otherwise, there's a dangerous electrolyte imbalance that happens. So you really need to think about how things are going to be used. In a school situation, take a look at anything particular that for the kids. And, especially with younger kids, you've got to consider they're in a scary situation, and making things familiar to them may be an important factor. Having things in your school cafeteria that are good to break out during an event that are familiar, or comfort foods can go a long way. Even having games available. You want to make a scary situation as calm as possible. How much room is all this stuff going to take up? That's a consideration. And actually, surprisingly, even for a period of 3 days, the types of things you need actually don't take up too much space. So really consider spreadsheeting this type of thing, and because you really have to take a look at each and every one of the supplies that you need. We have a tool that we've developed that uses best practices and a lot of metrics and kind of gives you an idea of things to consider, but certainly doing it on a spreadsheet and thinking about it in the type of detail that you need to is a very effective way to do things. Talk about usability. So you've got your supplies, and this is probably one of the worst examples we've seen, but somebody went and got supplies and threw it in a storage shed and made an attempt to label things, but this is not very usable, and there may be things in here that are even expired. This is actually a little better attempt at doing that, but what you see is it's very nondescript. It's all in its original package. It's very confusing, and in some cases may be difficult to access. So what you really need to do is start thinking about your supply cache as one giant, well-organized kit. Knowing where things are, even taking to the point where you have a map on the wall and people can easily identify where things are, especially in the heat of an emergency. And so there's, again, thinking about things as one giant kit, there's actually some very useful hints that can happen. Simple things like color coding can go a long way. You may have a situation where you need to get things distributed and your emergency response team is busy taking care of a very critical item. You may need to press into action some untrained volunteers, or maybe there's a parent that is there to help out, and instead of saying, I need you to get all the first aid triage supplies and take them over to that area, and you get kind of a deer in the headlight look, and it says, what is triage? Well, instead of having to explain what the items are and what to look for, simply saying, well, go get all the things with the red tags on them and take them over that area. It's a very simple way to make that happen. Group things functionally. You're going to be setting up areas depending on the nature of the event. And so to be able to roll out all your first aid triage items to the area that you're going to set up from that standpoint is very helpful. Being able to distribute the food and the water is necessary. In the case of schools, being able to make that a very simple and easy event, because you're going to have a lot of impatient little ones around possibly that may need to get stuff done right away. Let's look at allocations. And again, as there are a number of things that may be common to an emergency response team, things like vests and hard hats and gloves and flashlights. It's important to understand who gets what. And what if you had a search and rescue team that got very enthusiastic and grabbed all the flashlights? Well, now the other areas, such as your incident command area or your first aid and triage area, are now impacted. They can't do their job because somebody took all the flashlights. So it's very important that people understand what the allocations were in the original plan, and think about that beforehand instead of trying to figure out during the event. And by knowing the original assumptions, those are assigned based on the particular need. And if everybody understands what they are and knows what the allocation plan is, maybe there are situations where the search and rescue teams need more than what was originally thought. But at least you're making that decision, and you're not having to call search and rescue team back in to get flashlights to be able, for the other areas to be able to even function. So that kind of open communication and awareness about what the plan is, what the allocation is, and that everyone knows becomes very important from that standpoint. Look about a little bit at distribution and deployment of those supplies. Now, so you've taken my advice and thought about how much you need. You about the half gallon of water per person per day, and about 2,400 calories of food. That even applies to children, because it's not a scaled type of event where they need less. They actually need very close to what an adult does, and something you don't want to skimp on, especially with the younger ones. But let's say you have to hand out some emergency blankets and maybe some ponchos, and earthquake country, we hand out dust masks as well, because there's a lot of debris in the area. But how do you get those things to everybody very quickly? And when you have pallets of items, you end up with multiple distribution points. And if you think about it, for each item that you're having to hand out, you need probably about 3 people. You need one person handing out the item. You need one person that's kind of ferrying the item from the pallet to the distribution table, and you need somebody to kind of break down the pallet and climb over things to get at stuff. And when you start throwing in handing out food, and then water, then emergency blankets, and ponchos, it can become a very large cafeteria type operation very quickly, and it can be very difficult to control. It's going to be challenging enough to control that with adults, and adults may be trying to get back in line and hoard things and get additional things. It may be even more difficult to control if you've got a school and a lot of young kids. so you want to make this very simple and efficient if you need to get supplies to the students. And depending what you're handing out and the scope of what you're handing out, you may have to have this happen multiple times a day. And then the people that are tasked with doing the emergency events, they're not going to necessarily be there at those particular times. So you kind of have to keep this giant cafeteria operation going all day. And again, it's very labor intensive. So what if you could put everything into a single kit to distribute? And it, there in this particular situation, there's the half a gallon of water, there's 2,400 calories worth of food, there's an emergency blanket, poncho, a light stick, a dust mask, and a whistle. If you're doing this with children, you probably want to not have the whistles there because you're going to go crazy with 400 students that have a whistle at their disposal. So you really have to think about your audience here that you're trying to supply and what they really need and how you want to handle it. But the important idea is that you're getting things in a kit form. It's a single point of distribution, and those same 2 or 3 people, and just those 2 or 3 people can hand out an awful lot of stuff in a short period of time. It's a controlled distribution. You're creating ownership of that resource. That employee or that student now has everything they need to take care of themselves, at least for a 24-hour period. When we talk to companies, a lot of times, depending on the nature of the event, people will try to get home, and they may not be able to, either because of distance or because of the area around them that's having a particular issue. And so those folks that choose to go home or can go home, they at least have a resource to take with them for the journey home, because you're going from a point of refuge where you know what the situation is to an unknown point of refuge, or to an unknown point, and you don't know what the issues are along the way. So at least they have something to take with them. Case of schools, it's a different situation, and so you have to kind of think about how kids are going to be able to get home, how parents are going to be able to pick them up, and the supplies you want to have, and how long you think you're going to be kind of in the custodial nature of that particular event with the students, and what they should have at their disposal from that standpoint. Now let's talk a little bit about deployment of supplies and some of the most effective methods. And I've seen all kinds of different situations where people have gotten supplies and they put them on shelves. They're beautifully labeled, all a la carte. But when you think about how it's going to work functionally, you create a situation. Let's use emergency response as an example, where the rescuer is having to go in and literally shop for the things they think they need to rescue somebody. And so the focus is not rescuing somebody, it's then trying to decide, do they have everything they think they need? What did I forget? And trying to figure out where everything is. And so you're losing a lot of valuable time. And if you look at that picture, that guy's on his foot, so it's very cumbersome what he's trying. And similar to what we talked about with employee or student kits, having things, a robust set of supplies that are easily deployable, and putting anything you can think of that in kit form wherever possible, and a collection of items and for search and rescue that will cover a wide variety of situations. The team literally goes in, grabs their kits, and they can focus on the situation. Better yet, these kits spread out surgically over a site, or maybe even a school campus setting, so that you can get things to people when they need them right away, and you're avoiding that shopping situation. So things need to be easy to transport. Again, having something as simple as a rolling container, rapid deployment, and having the wide variety of things you need for a variety of situations. And the focus is on the task at hand. You're not having your team all gathered in the emergency supply cache, having discussions on what they think they need and who has what, who's going to take what. Boom, you go in and the task gets done. Let's talk a little bit about coverage, and I'm going to talk about coverage, some nuances probably about schools that you need to consider as well. And you really think, how many people are you trying to cover, and how do you figure out, you know, how what you do? Is it a historical reference point? Is it a guess based on budgets? And sometimes it's all of the above. And many times coverage is based on a previous reference point. So the one I talk about out here in California is the Loma Prieta earthquake we had in 1989. And those of you that saw it, there were certainly some terrible things that happened. We had a bridge collapse, we had some freeways collapse, and we had the Marina District in San Francisco, a lot of building collapses and fires. But by and large, the roads were not affected to a great degree in the Bay Area, consider that we had a major earthquake. And so people were able to get home after some ended period of time. And when people look back at that event, they say, well, everybody left except for 10%. Sometimes they use that as a reference point. Well, I probably should say when it happened more in the Bay Area proper, it's a completely different situation. And so if we did what we call a fixed coverage scenario, where somebody said, well, you know, everybody left last time, I'm going to cover a third of the employees or a third of the students or a third of the staff. That initially is saying is that 2/3 of the employees that you're thinking are going to go home are at risk because they're leaving a known point of refuge without anything at their disposal to make this journey home, whether it's a mile or 5 miles or 10 miles. If a situation changes, let's say it happened late in the day and it started to get dark, or the weather's really bad and people say, I'm going to stick around at least until the morning and then I'm going to venture out. Well, now you have 100% of the people there, and they're literally going to consume all the items that were meant for a third of the people for the first 24 hours. So mathematically, day 2 and day 3, there are no supplies for the people that truly get stuck there for an extended period of time. One thing you can do is what we like to utilize is it's 100% coverage with an attrition rate model tied to it. And really what you're saying is that for the first 24 hours, 100% of the people get covered. And they have the supplies that they need for the first 24 hours. People that are decide to venture home, they at least have something to take with them. And then you can make some assumptions, say that, for example, maybe you assume 50% of the people will still be around day 2, another 50% will leave for day 3, and that way you've at least made a more flexible scenario. And if for some reason things are a little bit more involved, you have some flexibility there. You can actually get a little more scientific if you want and look at a commute distance chart for employees and where they live, and come up with something that maybe use 10 miles as a distance for people may try to go home, and then adjust the day 3 from that standpoint. We actually had a client that had their headquarters in one town for many years, and naturally most of the employees lived fairly close to work and had a decent commute distance. And in the original situation, they had about, I think it was 35 or 40% of the people lived within 10 miles. They relocated their headquarters to another area, and all of a sudden you were in a situation where only, I think it was 8 or 9% of the employee lived within 10 miles. So they really had to make some decisions on their day 2 and day 3 coverage because a lot of their folks were going to get stuck during a major event where a lot of the roads and the infrastructures were compromised. Oh, and again, just get back with coverage. Really need to think about the situation you have with students, because not only you're not going to let them go home, even if they live within a certain distance. You really have to be in a situation where parents are going to pick them up and take responsibility from your custodial care to them being with their parents or their designated individual. And so people commute long distances nowadays, and depending on where you are in the country and what your metropolitan area looks like, it may be a long time before parents can get away to pick up their kids. They may get stuck. San Francisco Bay Area is a prime example. We have a lot of people that commute in 30 or 40 miles, and they can be in a spot where they can't get home for a day or two. So schools out here really have to take into consideration how long they think they're going to have custodial care of students from that standpoint. I may have run into those situations with your weather back there as of late and some of the flooding, and were people stuck, or were school couldn't have access for kids getting picked up for a certain period of time. And so there may be some different assumptions you have to make just because you are a school going forward. Now, this section is actually the most important section, is exercising with your supplies. And a lot of times somebody will go out and they'll get the supplies, and nobody is aware of what they are. Maybe it's the head of facilities will get supplies for a company or the EH&S person. A lot of times in the case of school districts, it's bought centrally, and somebody gets supplies for all the schools, and there's certain assumptions that are made, and the school may or may not be aware of what they have or what the resources were. And kind of the joke is, who has the key? What's in the supply cache? The team has never even seen what they have at their disposal. They never have had a chance to utilize the supplies in a manner to become familiar with them. Setting up a canopy may be, some of them take it for granted because we've set them up before. It's actually pretty easy, but if you've never done it, there's a certain sequence that you need to go through. So being familiar with setting up things like the area or organizing a triage area start to become important. And we've seen many response plans that really don't have or acknowledge that they have supplies. And so there's no tie to the plan and the training. And sometimes they think, well, we're not going to go to the level of training where we actually try out the supplies and utilize them, maybe just relying on tabletops. You lose a lot by not touching and using and seeing how supplies work. And then, the team becomes has limited awareness of what's even in your supply cache. And the supply cache may not even support your plan. Do you have inadequate and rescue, I had planned called for full-blown search and rescue and full-blown training around rescue. This is an example that this is a client that really went to the degree. They looked at their metrics. They designed a very robust supply solution. And during one of their exercises, they decided to do is list out everything they had functionally in their supply cache. And they became familiar with what they had. And what they really ended up finding out was there was some interesting groupings. There was one grouping of supplies that were organizational in nature, they called it. Those were the things that were setting up a supply, setting up your event, setting up your incident command, head count lists, hard hats, vests, pencils, tables, building plans, and those types of things. They called that their open for business. That's what they needed to start getting things going for their emergency response. The next group of items were more situational. Things like sanitation, or excuse me, things like search and rescue, first aid and triage. It was a medical event, and let's go in and grabbing some of the first aid supplies. If it was a much larger event, again, maybe an earthquake like we have around here, you're going to get into search and rescue, you're going to get into first aid and triage, you're going to get into building evacuation and floor sweeps and things of those nature. The last thing that they found was that things were not only situational but time-bound. And that's where it's like, okay, we're going to be in here for more than 8 hours or 24 hours. This is going to be a multi-day event. And again, that's something that can certainly happen here in earthquake country with us. Identify that a lot now with your area in terms of severe weather and flooding and those types of events. So you really need to think about the things that are time-bound, and those can be things like sanitation, where the infrastructure is compromised, handing out supplies day 2 and day 3, that extra food and water. So what ended up happening from that standpoint is that this team now became intimately supplies that they had. They knew what was the things that needed to get set up first, and they practiced with their supplies. And the best story I have for this particular situation was when they practiced with their supplies during search and rescue, they realized they had a lot of petite people on their emergency response search and rescue team. And the hard hats were hard to keep on, and the gloves were standard work gloves, and they were literally swimming in those gloves. And so when they did their after-action hot wash, they identified that as an issue. And the net to that was to get special order hard hats and some fitted gloves. When looking at their supplies initially, you would say they have everything they need, and they had very robust, very well thought out set of supplies. They had hard hats, they had the gloves, but in actual usage, there was an issue, and they only found that out by practicing with those items. So that will be the most important thing is to practice. So we've covered a lot of topics today, and the whole idea was to get you to think about your resources based on your threats and your needs, and not just go out and get some supplies of what you think you need. So look at the metrics. Look at each item that you're getting. Looking at the flashlight, well, what's batteries? You need batteries. How many batteries you need? What's the usage rate on the flashlight? Or food bars, water, those types of things. Understand the metrics. Make sure it's usable. Put things in a kit form wherever possible, and make sure that it's all organized very well, very intuitive. We talked about color coding, allocation assumptions. Everybody needs to be aware on certain items that they have they're allocated a certain amount of those. We use the example of flashlight. That can make a situation very efficient or very inefficient, and that could put people at risk if those things aren't understood. Distribution, deployment, think about how those things are going to be handed out. You probably have an added nuance in terms of how you're going to get things to students, because you've got to help them. There's a lot more involved in how you're going to get the things that a student needs and make sure they have it, and how you want the interface to happen. May be different than a corporate situation. Think about coverage. We talked about some attrition rate models, the importance of actually having stuff for everyone for the first 24 hours. You have particular nuances with students and custodial issues, and when parents won't pick them up. So have to do some additional thinking and additional insight into the nature of where parents work and what scenarios can happen, and how people get picked up, and reunification plans and those types of things. And finally, exercising with supplies. If you haven't learned anything else, just make sure you exercise, because that's when you're going to really find out what worked and what didn't work, and are you meeting the objective you have set forth in terms of protecting the health and safety of employees and, in your case, students, based on the variety of threats that you have. If you exercise with them, it'll go much smoother during an actual event, and you want to minimize impacts on students and staff from that standpoint. So making things go quickly and efficiently will be very important. At Firestorm, we like to look at things in a predict, plan, and perform model. So make sure you've identified your threats, you have a clear view of your objectives, and that you design your supply resources based on those objectives, and think about how you're going to get things out and deployed very efficiently. Make sure your team is trained and oriented on all the supply and assumptions. It's not just you've got a box that's got supplies stored away somewhere. Make sure everybody knows their usage, the allocation, and train with your supplies, and continuously update your plan, your approach based on an after-event hot wash. And hopefully that after-event hot wash is not based on an actual event, but based on a very well thought out exercise that you do, that you test your team. Because during an actual event, you want to make sure that everything goes very smoothly. The information from this webinar will be available in a couple of days, and you can find that by going to firestormbreeze.com and be able to download the information presented today. I want to thank the Georgia Independent School Association for joining us today, and hopefully you've got another thing to think about in your emergency response approach.
Thank you, Jeff. If you need to contact Jeff, you'll notice his number and the contact information is there, jhamilton@firestorm.com, and Jeff would be delighted to share with you ideas how to prepare better for disaster. Thank you again. Join us next month, please, for another in this series. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.